We've reached that point in US history again where things have gotten so crazy that many feel it could boil over into civil war. And whereas the US is a failing state, doctrinally speaking, there's intelligent analysis of that fact, and then there are people who clearly don't know what they're talking about. So let's get after it. I'm James Merritt, emergency manager and career soldier, and this is Readiness Nation. So, civil conflict and strife in the US will be a recurring topic of discussion on this channel as one, civil conflagration as it's called, is one of the primary man-made disaster types in emergency management. And two, as a field-grade civil affairs officer, it's literally my job to analyze the human terrain within the battle space, identify the sources of stability and instability, and develop the strategy to empower the sources of stability and mitigate the sources of instability. So this whole conversation is central to what we do in my current MOS. And furthermore, if you're new here, before I was a civil affairs officer, I was an infantry officer. So I'm an actual school-trained warfighter and Afghanistan veteran. And before that, I started out in the Army as an enlisted combat medic. So I got a front row seat to the actual human costs of war. But with that said, what follows doesn't represent the opinions, policies, or perspectives of the DoD or the DHS. It's the wholly owned intellectual property of Readiness Nation, LLC. So, getting to the point, what was that I was saying about the US doctrinally being a failing state? Well, the US Army Stability Operations Series of Doctrine, 3-07, uses the Fragile States Framework, in which a destabilizing state is considered a failing state. Once a state fully destabilizes, it's considered a failed state, and typically some form of crisis like a civil war or a genocide occurs. It typically requires external intervention to pull a failed state out of crisis and elevate it to recovering state status. This is where US stability operations comes in. If effective, the state fully recovers, becoming a stable state once again. Doctrinally, both the failing state period and the recovering state period are considered to make a state a vulnerable state. Furthermore, the failed state period is considered to be the crisis state. The US is currently demonstrating several areas of critical instability. We have widespread failures of civil security, significant threats to civil control, degrading essential services, and mounting economic instability. All of these sources of instability directly and adversely impact citizens' lives, and are leading to a complete loss of faith in civic institutions. Getting into all of this in full detail is very long, very dense, and very dry. So I'm still trying to figure out how to present it all in a way that people will actually watch it. But the important takeaway is that if you feel like we're teetering on the brink, you're not wrong. The professional literature on the subject and the analytical tools therein all indicate that the US is in fact a failing state. And if we continue to destabilize until we hit failed state status, civil war or genocide are entirely plausible outcomes. So today I'll be reviewing the article Could America Break Apart? UCSB Expert Explores the Possibility by Tom Jacobs in the UC Santa Barbara newspaper, link in the description, which itself is an interview with UCSB professor Benjamin Cohen about his new book on secessionist movements. The first thing we need to discuss is how the book and this article begins, with a fictional news dispatch from the year 2035, which reads, "After years of festering discontent with the direction of politics in Washington, California today formally declares its independence as a sovereign nation. President Vance has threatened a military takeover of state government in Sacramento, backed by National Guard troops from nearby red states. Armed conflict looks increasingly possible." The first thing we need to discuss is good for Cohen that he recognizes that we're most likely looking at an inverted Reagan with the political moment that we're in right now. What I mean by that is that in the late 70s we had the single-term spectacularly failed presidency of Jimmy Carter. There's profound economic strife in the form of stagflation, supply chain problems leading to extreme gasoline shortages, and foreign policy failures like the Iran hostage crisis. So all in all, a pretty bad time for America. This in turn led to the presidency of Ronald Reagan, who's not only a successful two-term president, he was such a successful president that his vice president, George Bush Sr., was elected after Reagan's second term, giving one party 12 consecutive years in the Oval Office, something that's only happened 3 times in the last 100 years. With the failed Biden administration mirroring the Carter administration in several key ways, combined with the fact that Trump can only serve out his current term, this does set the table for 8 years of J.D. Vance starting in 2028. So good political analysis on Cohen's part here. However, the military and legal analysis is quite poor. The first issue is that if any state, or coherent group for that matter, declares their independence from the US, that would provide the legal predicate for an invocation of the Insurrection Act. Invoking the Insurrection Act authorizes the use of Title X federal military forces on US soil for the purposes of quelling the insurrection. So anyone who engages in insurrection against the US will have to contend with the totality of the US military, not just the National Guard. For more information on which military components can be used under which circumstances, check out my video Martial Law Isn't Real. But with the ability to use Title X forces, all components of the US military can be used to completely cut off the rebelling states from the rest of the world. The use of cyber and electronic warfare capabilities would take all of the rebelling states' telecommunications infrastructure offline, preventing not only military command and control, but also civilian information dissemination and all communications involved in commerce. Couple this with the use of land and naval blockades to prevent the rebelling states from engaging in trade with anyone, or getting the supplies that they need to sustain their military or maintain their infrastructure, and this war is over before the first shot is even fired. But once we're talking about kinetic military operations, any member of the government or military, or any industrial or commercial facilities that support the government or military of the rebelling states are all valid military targets, and the US government would be fully legally justified in bombing them. Whatever's left can easily be mopped up by a ground invasion. So it really isn't possible for anything less than half-ish of the states, having the full allegiance of about half-ish of the US military, to even be able to make a meaningful attempt at a forceful secession. And after a failed attempt at secession, the rebelling states would lose significant political power for the duration of the Reconstruction period, just like the South did after the Civil War. So if they don't like how things are running in the US now, they'll really hate it after losing the Second Civil War. As such, the only plausible mechanism of rebellion in the US is insurgency, which the full discussion of will have to be a whole separate video. But to his credit, Cohen does acknowledge that there's no contiguous landmass within the US that could secede as a new single country. But he then goes on to say, I consider secession a grievously underappreciated phenomena. My motivation to write this book was to call people's attention to this fact. We tend to simplify geography by looking exclusively at the existing lines on a map that separate one sovereign state from another. But the reality is there are many people within those states that are very unhappy with the arrangement. They'd prefer to draw the lines in a different way. In some cases, they're prepared to fight to redraw those lines. He's not wrong about this, but when it comes to the US in particular, he's either leaving out or not fully familiar with the fact that the question of secession was answered militarily with our first Civil War and answered legally after with the 1869 case Texas v. White. In Texas v. White, the Supreme Court ruled that states have no authority to unilaterally secede, nor does the Constitution provide for or include a mechanism for states to leave the Union. So, an amendment to the Constitution that establishes such a mechanism would have to be ratified before any state could lawfully leave. As such, the various people in the various parts of the US can feel any kind of way they want about the lines drawn on the map. But secession really isn't legally or militarily possible for any state, or any group of states less than about half of them. But that leads me to my last point, and I'm very disappointed that as a political economist he didn't pick up on this, which is that secession from the US isn't economically possible even if the country did fully split in half. And fighting a second civil war in earnest could very well cause global financial collapse. Now, it's consistently proven to be the case that all sorts of laws of economics that apply to other economies don't apply to the US economy. This is because we're the largest and, believe it or not, most stable economy on Earth, which makes us what economists call the cleanest dirty shirt. This saying refers to when you haven't done laundry in a while and so everything is dirty, but you're looking for the cleanest dirty shirt to put on while you go do laundry. What this means economically is that you're looking for the least bad place to put your money. To way oversimplify it, once value's been generated, it must be stored in some form of economic vessel. There isn't actually any such thing as getting your money out. It can only be pulled from whatever vessel it's currently in and stored in a different vessel. So when there's national or global economic strife, everyone is looking for the best vessel to store their value in. And when they're all bad, people are looking for the one that's the least bad, or the cleanest dirty shirt, which in a global context is pretty much always the US. As such, there's always a market for our bonds no matter how much debt we owe, or even if there's a plausible plan to pay it all back. But this is entirely predicated on the size and stability of the US economy. It literally pays to be number one. But if the US balkanized into 2 or more smaller countries, it would no longer be the world's largest economy. And it may very well lose a great deal of its stability. Global fears would mount if the US would fracture further and if the resulting nations are capable of paying their debts. As such, the resulting countries would have to continuously raise the rate on their bonds, which raises their debt, which increases their risk of default. This cycle is the kind of debt spiral that has caused nation after nation throughout the developing world to become failed states. Unlike with these relatively small economies becoming failed states, the US at present has more than $36 trillion of outstanding bonds, 30% of which are in foreign hands. So if the US defaults on its debts, not only would that completely destroy the US economy, but $11 trillion would disappear from balance sheets around the world, which would fully destabilize and most likely cause the collapse of every developed economy on Earth. I explain how all of this works in full detail in my video, How the World Actually Ends. But there you have it. There's no lawful mechanism for states to peacefully leave the Union. It's exceedingly unlikely any coalition of states could successfully secede by force, and it's even less likely that any fraction of the US is economically viable as a country on its own. So no, the US can't break apart. At least not without triggering a cascade of effects that would end the totality of the developed world. Love it or hate it, the US is the central tentpole of modernity, and if we go down, we're taking everyone with us. So for better or worse, we're all stuck together, and everyone's stuck with us. But that's going to be it for me. So if you found this information useful, give me the old controlled pair on the like and subscribe buttons. And if you found this information useful enough that you want to buy me a beer about it, there's a link to my Patreon and Subscribe Star in the description. So until next time, this is James Merritt for Readiness Nation, reminding you to always be the master of your fate and the captain of your soul.